I've chosen to break it down into 3 different categories. Prices ranging in USD as a currency. These prices may fluctuate depending on the time of your viewing. The first range we're going to talk about is $500. For less than $500, you can pick yourself up a Canon EOS M100. This camera is a great option. It shoots in full HD, has 60p HD, is compact, takes SD cards, and is super portable. It also offers autofocus, which is something you could utilize for vlogging, or it could be utilized as a B-roll camera. It's something I wish I had when I first started filmmaking. This camera also offers an APS-C sensor. What that means is that it's going to have a much bigger sensor than, say, a Micro Four Thirds camera, which we'll talk about next. When you have a bigger sensor, you can achieve a more shallow depth of field without trying. You're going to utilize more of that glass that you have because the sensor is going to utilize more of the lens. One downside to this camera is that it's not the best in low light, and we do not have 4K. It's always nice to shoot at 4K and downscale to 1080p. What this does is create a much sharper image. And in post, you can actually crop your image depending on what kind of shooting you're doing. All in all, for under $500 and to come with the lens, this camera is an incredible choice. Next up on our list is the Panasonic G7. When Panasonic came out with the GH4, everybody was thrilled. We finally had a small compact DSLR that shot in 4K. Now it all sounds great and fancy. However, we always had a couple issues. One, the sensor was too small, and the other one was that the battery life wasn't the best. There are a lot of pros to this camera, but not having shallow depth of field is really going to hurt when trying to create a very cinematic image. Just because you're shooting in 4K doesn't mean that you're going to have an awesome image. That just means that you're going to have more pixels in your image. But are the pixels good? Are you going to have high dynamic range? Those kind of things. All in all, this camera is amazing. You can shoot at 60p, you have 4K with a small sensor, and the Micro Four Thirds is very flexible in terms of finding adapters, and being able to get any kind of glass on that camera is really easy. We also have very good color profiles on the camera, so you can shoot flat and you can color grade a lot in post. Although this camera battery life isn't the best, you can still have a decent record time and you can record straight to an SD card. All in all, these cameras at $500 is unbelievable. I remember when HD cameras were minimum couple thousands of dollars and the dynamic range wasn't good and we were nowhere near 4K. Let's move on to the next category. The next price range we're going to talk about is $750 to $1,500. Let's start off with the Sony A6500. I remember when the Sony A6300 came out. This was just an incredible camera. Sony has been killing it in the camera industry. With their low light capabilities and bringing 4K, things have been booming for Sony. One thing to look out for in these kind of cameras is the fact that the sensors aren't always very big, like we talked about previously. And another issue that you may experience is the color. For me personally, I mostly care about dynamic range and sensor size for cinematic image. But in this price range, the Sony A6500 is probably the best all-around camera you can get, hands down, especially at the price. The first pro I want to talk about this camera is that it is a full APS-C sensor size. There are a lot of great things to talk about with this camera. First of all, it's an improvement from their A6300 model, which I didn't want to include into this. The problem with the A6300 is that filmmakers would experience overheating issues. This camera shoots at 120 frames a second in full HD. This is a shot I used for one of my commercials. Sometimes you want to utilize that slow motion and really capture a good moment. This camera did an amazing job, and in post it was quite easy to color grade. Another great pro about this camera is the fact that it's so dang small. You can also use Sony lenses, which are incredible because they use Zeiss. Another pro to this camera is that the dynamic range is pretty high. So when you're shooting at 4K or downscaling to 1080p, you're gonna have a really good dynamic range and you're gonna have a lot of good detail in your image. A couple of great things about the Sony A6500 is that it's a good low light camera and it has incredible image and body stabilization. One downside to this camera is that the battery length is not so good. But really, all in all, this camera is gotta be the best bang for your buck. The next camera we're gonna talk about is the Panasonic G85. Now, why is this camera different than the G7? Well, a couple things I've noticed. I've been using the Panasonic G85, which is filming right there in that camera, and it's a very good camera. The reason I purchased this over the Panasonic G7 is because you can record for a longer period of time, and that extra image and body stabilization and updates are a little bit better. One amazing feature about this camera is that you can actually pull out your phone and operate the camera wirelessly. This allows you to do a lot of things. So if you're trying to get an overhead shot, you have a lot of control over the camera, and you don't always have to touch the camera or move it, or it basically just allows you to have a lot of control in this modern age. Compared to the Sony A6500, this is a great camera. I would say that the coloring in this camera is a little bit better, and at 4K side by side, they match quite well. One thing the Sony A6500 has that the Panasonic doesn't is that it has low light capabilities and incredible slow motion. You can't beat 120 frames a second. Look how good this looks. At 60 frames a second at full HD, this camera does very well. And the color profiles are incredible. When you shoot flat on a Panasonic G85, you're gonna have a great look. And in post-production, you can do so much work to make it look that much better. One other incredible thing about the Panasonic G85 is that it actually has a screen that you can turn around. With the built-in autofocus, which may not be better than Sony's, it allows you to do incredible vlogging and gives you a lot of control. Like even right now I'm filming and I can see myself. Another good feature is the layout of the camera. Now, navigating different cameras, especially when you're first learning, can be difficult. I find that Canon and Panasonic do a great job at laying out their menu. So being able to format cards, change your color profile, and just anything is very easy. Compared to Sony, it's a little more messy and kind of hard to find some things. All in all, if you had the money, I would go with the Sony A6500 because that camera is just a beast, but you will not be disappointed with the Panasonic G85. So we're now into the $2,000 to $3,000 USD price range. It was really hard to choose two cameras that would fit well in this category. I kind of wanted to have two cameras that were a little bit different. However, one is an all-around camera and the other one is kind of a beast for reasons that we'll talk about in just a minute. A very good candidate is the Sony A7S 2 or 3. These cameras may be a little bit more than $3,000, but they're very close. They're not going into the $4,500 to $10,000 range. Now, the first camera I want to talk about is the Canon C100, which generally comes with no lens at about $2,000 USD now. Now, the Canon C100 has been my go-to camera for the past 5 years. When I first got this camera, I noticed a few things. Unlike a standard DSLR, you actually have a top handle, which is great for audio. It has different preamps, which allows you to use better microphones, and it gives you more control over the audio. Most cameras, I'm not going to talk about the audio till our audio section, because audio is very hard to get on a DSLR, and you really want to go external. The preamps in your cameras on a DSLR are not going to be good. So you want to bring the preamps low when miking a camera directly into a DSLR. But really the best way to do it is to get a camera like the Canon C100, which offers that feature, but is also more bulky. So there's good sides and downsides. Now the Canon C100 is kind of a hybrid DSLR and maybe upper level camera. One amazing feature is that it does have good low light capabilities. This camera can shoot at about 20,000 ISO, but gets a little messy. I wouldn't go over 6,000 ISO. Otherwise, you're implementing some grain. Your native ISO is 850 on this camera, so it's gonna be more sensitive to light. This can be good or bad, but let's talk about some of the other amazing features. You have 2 dual SD cards. You have incredible 2 to 3 hours battery runtime, depending on which model battery you get. You do have that top handle, like I said. You have a Super 35 sensor, which gives you a lot of depth of field. It's actually the same sensor in the Canon C300. You have a sensor that is not 4K, but is 4K downscaled to 1080p, which is a very, very sharp 1080p image. We're gonna talk about resolution and frame rates later. This camera also shoots in C-Log, which is a very flat image, which you can color grade and post just like this. Another amazing feature, which is hands down my favorite, are the built-in ND filters. So on the side of this camera, you flick up the switch and you have ND 2 to 6. And what this does is allow you to shoot outdoors when you're in too bright of situations and you want to capture shallow depth of field, which is something I want to teach you guys in the outdoor section, how to use ND filters with our Red Cape Films variable ND filters. Because you have dual SD cards, you can actually record to either both cards at the same time, so when one gets full, it goes to the other, or you can record 2 at the same time. So if you're filming a wedding and one card breaks, you have the option to have redundancy when filming on this camera. It's also a much bigger camera, so when handling handheld, it works very good for documentary and all. All in all, it's a very great documentary camera. The screen does not rotate, which is probably one very big downside. You can get caught up in the gear, the specs, and so much about camera gear. The story is the most important thing to think about when filmmaking. You don't want to get caught up in the camera specs or anything like that. One thing that I love about the Canon C100, while it may not have 4K, it doesn't have a swivel screen, you do have everything else that you need. You can pick up this camera and film anywhere. You can film anything. You can film when it's dark outside, not pitch black, but pretty dark. It's an actual video camera, and it gets to be a step beyond digital SLRs. And just because it doesn't have 4K doesn't mean that people aren't gonna think that you're shooting in 4K with this camera, because the dynamic range is incredible. You have tons of detail, especially when you shoot at the 850 native. Now the next camera I wanna talk about is the Panasonic GH5. Now this camera came out more recently. Cameras are coming out all the time, so be aware of that. The Panasonic G85 is a very special camera. This camera, you could say, is the best bang for your buck, getting into the $2,000 to $3,000 range, but it doesn't have a big sensor or good low light capabilities. But if you're lighting your scenes, if you're using lights and you know what you're doing and you're utilizing techniques we're going to talk about, and you get a couple accessories, this camera takes everything to the next level. We have 4K with almost little to no compression. We're gonna get to a point where we can shoot 4K RAW in a small compact camera like this one. A very important thing to note about this camera is that you do have a micro four thirds sensor. So you either wanna use micro four thirds lenses, or if you're using a Canon, your crop factor is gonna be implemented. If you're using a 50mm prime lens on the C100, it's not gonna crop in too much. It's gonna be around a 1.3 to 1.6 crop. But on the GH5, you're gonna have a 2 times crop. Now we do have a lot of great micro four thirds lenses, and we'll talk about more lenses in the lens section. Pros about the GH5, it shoots a high quality 4K image. The Panasonic GH5 doesn't compress your image as much. So you have a lot of quality and a lot of information there. However, you're gonna fill up cards much quicker. And you are gonna need better cards that are more expensive. Instead of compressing the image, it retains all that quality information. However, your cards fill up much quicker, and you're gonna need a better computer to edit with the GH5 footage. The GH5 has amazing color profiles. I was quite blown away. I've used Vlog before. Here's some shots. We actually used this for the Surviving the Door intro, and this camera in slow motion is very good. It shoots at 120 frames, but also when you start shooting in a slow motion, you're not gonna have the 4K. You're gonna be stuck with the 1080p, but it still looks really good. If you have the money, I would definitely pick up a GH5 over the C100. It's much more new, but again, it comes down to what you're filming. There's really not much you can film. Unless you need slow motion, I would pick up a G85. Thank you for watching this section. All in all, depending on your budget, these are the cameras that I would recommend.